we talk about something called realists and idealists. And in our domestic politics, we have right now some rather firm positions by liberals and conservatives. In foreign affairs, those labels don't really apply because there are some very, very idealistic conservatives and there's some very, very practically minded liberals, but there isn't a track that you can walk that would allow you to see that there is a connection. Idealists are focused on our values, on human rights. Realists are more pragmatic. They focus on national interests. What have we got in this game? Why would we be involved? Neither are right or wrong. One might be more appropriate for a particular kind of situation. But our foreign policy through most of its history has been highly idealistic. American exceptionalism, the shining city on the hill, were all factors that defined the United States and influenced its foreign policy. A quick review. It's been a long summer. Lots of things have happened. So let's go back and look at the beginning. Russia's invasion in February 2022 began with dozens of missiles strikes on cities all over Ukraine. Russian ground troops moved in quickly and within a few weeks were in control of large areas of Ukraine and had advanced to the suburbs of Kyiv. Russian forces were bombarding Kharkiv, that's over in the eastern side, northeastern side of Ukraine. And they had taken territory to the east and south as far as Kherson. You see Kherson down there? And surrounded the port city of Mariupol. I think it is important to add that to most Western military minds, that's making an assumption there. I was in the military too, so I can understand. Expected President Zelensky and his cabinet to head for Poland once the Russian troops crossed the border. But Zelensky has shown real and impressive fortitude. But the Russians faced very strong Ukrainian resistance almost everywhere and faced serious logistical problems with poorly motivated Russian troops suffering shortages of water, food, and ammunition. Also a factor was the weather. February is a hostile time to test your equipment and soldiers. There was a World War II adage that came out that we fight a new war with the old generals, the old strategies, and the old equipment. That's what Russia was doing. Ukraine, not so much. Ukrainian forces were also quick to deploy Western-supplied arms, such as a very important anti-tank system, which proved highly effective against the Russian advance. By October of 2022, the picture had changed dramatically, and having failed to take Kyiv, Russia withdrew completely from the north. Just as a point of reference, every source I found suggests that Russia currently holds about 20% of Ukraine. A huge side story of the war is the role of Yevgeny Prigozhin. From a connection in St. Petersburg, where Prigozhin sold hot dogs on the street, while Putin was on the staff of Leningrad's Mayor Sobchak, where I met Putin back in 1992. He was the international affairs aide to Mayor Sobchak, but he was probably the KGB guy keeping an eye on this liberally minded mayor of St. Petersburg. Prigozhin has rode Putin's coattails until he was too much of a problem. Though I have not I've not had it confirmed, but I believe it was Prigozhin who was the chef, CHEF, mentioned in the Panama Papers. If you remember the Panama Papers that revealed the assets that were being held down, I guess it was in Panama, that from a number of leaders around the world, including from Western Europe. There was a large amount of money that Putin is alleged to have squirreled away in the chef's name. As recently as September 27th, Reuters was reporting that several hundred members of the Wagner Group have returned to the eastern Ukraine to fight. Well, that is now still being worked on. Wagner fighters played an important role in Russia's capture of the eastern city of Bakhmut. We don't have a map there. It's in the eastern side. In May, after one of the longest and fiercest battles of the war, they left Bakhmut after the battle, and some went to Belarus under a deal that ended a brief mutiny by Wagner in June, while we were all enjoying that summer weather, during which it took control of a Russian military headquarters and marched on Moscow. The Wagner chief, Prigozhin, was killed on August 23rd when a private jet in which he was traveling crashed in unexplained circumstances. Since then, the Kremlin has sought to bring the group under tighter state control. I'm sure conspiracy stories will be spun for years to come, but it does look like he was killed in that airplane crash. But it is not clear yet how his mercenary group, Wagner, will continue under new management, that is. Prigozhin's departure is not out of line with how Russians have dealt with earlier rogue entities under other people other than Putin. The Wagner Group is similar, but certainly not the same as the American company Blackwater, which was prominent in Afghanistan. Both recruit former military personnel at higher rates of pay. Wagner, especially in Ukraine, also used released convicts as shock troops. Go out there and fight, and you will let your sentence go away. The grain exports, a matter of great concern to lots of countries in Africa, lots in the Middle East, and also to Ukraine, and to a degree to Russia. The deal that Turkey put into effect last year was rejected by Russia in 2023. European sources suggest that 65% of Ukraine's grain exports are now going from the ports of Ismail up there on the Danube and Reni along the border of Ukraine and Romania. The grain is then transported by rivers and canals into the Black Sea via the Romanian seaports of Sulina and Constanța. In theory, it is safer to go this way, as vessels entering the Black Sea from the mouth of the river immediately enter Romanian-controlled territorial waters and NATO-controlled territorial waters. But Russia has also been attacking Ukraine's Danube ports using drones. We'll talk more about drones later. Since the river Danube forms part of the Ukraine's border with NATO, Russian attacks have added a geopolitical dimension as at least one Russian drone has been filmed exploding across the river from Ismail inside Romania. So where are we right now in the war in the South? In that I have no independent source of information about the war. And as Churchill said, The first casualty in war is the truth. So therefore, and I don't actually believe the American reports on this because they're basically using Ukrainian sources for those reports, and they're going to be colored by Ukraine wanting to make this look good. For the next two slides, I'm relying on BBC coverage, which I found as accurate as any other source. BBC's Gardner says this is the most strategically important part of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and if it is successful, could cut off Russia's supply lines that connect Russia to Crimea. However, the advance so far has been restricted to the area around Robotin. See that up there in the north of the red area. And Ukrainian forces have a long way to go if they hope they are to achieve this aim of reaching the Sea of Azov. Crimea continues to be a major target for Ukraine. It has stepped up the attacks in the past month, the latest a missile attack on the port of Sevastopol on 22 September. It came shortly after a major attack on the same city using cruise missiles supplied by the UK and France. It is reported to have caused significant damage to the dry docks, which are vital for maintenance of the Black Sea fleet. Again, these claims are based on Ukrainian provided information and not independently verifiable. Russia's Black Sea fleet is an important target for Kiev. It is seen as the flagship unit of Russia's Navy, and its ships have launched missiles at Ukraine, causing significant damage. It has also been threatening to block the Black Sea shipping routes that Ukraine has been using to export grain, which is a particular sticking point for Kiev currently. If you've got any questions as we go along, because we're moving through lots of material, put your hand up. And yes. They've already voted to be Russian. Yeah, well, okay. If you lived in Chicago, did you really vote? Yes, having traveled to that part of the Crimea was always, let me back up for a second. That whole area, a little bit larger amount of that, was all taken by Russia from the Ottoman Turks after they had already absorbed what had been Polish Ukraine in and that was in 1654. 1750s, they took all that terrain from the Ottoman Turks. It was never belonged to Ukraine. So that Crimea especially has always been a very important place for Russians, their southern getaway place. The drought situation affect the Ukrainian crop production this year? I don't know the answer to that. It hasn't shown up as an issue, but Europe has definitely been suffering from drought issue. Yes, yeah. What means that places that didn't have the drought are going to really make some money. Okay. Let's go to slide 6. This is the eastern part of the battle. Russia had controlled parts of this already since 2014, I believe it is, but I'm not sure. As Ukraine has been trying to widen the breach near Robotin, Russia has been bringing reinforcements into the region. The city of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine has endured some of the heaviest fighting of the war. It has been under Russian control for several months. but Ukraine has gained some ground in the surrounding villages, and the Ukraine Ministry of Defense says Ukraine has now secured 2 villages about 5 miles south of the city. And that's the end of my coverage of what the BBC was saying. But I think the advantage here goes to the offense. They can choose where they want to attack, and defense has to react. This is true in chess. It's true in a lot of things. Also, nowhere in this BBC report do we hear about the weather. And having gone through 4+ seasons of Russians, 4 years of Russian seasons, moving units about is normally difficult and will become increasingly more difficult because of rain, mud, poor roads, and then comes winter. The RAND Corporation, a major think tank predominantly for the U.S. military and national security sectors, recently provided this assessment on the war in Ukraine. And I'll read their assessments and then give a comment on them. A major factor in Ukraine's ability to recapture lost territory is NATO cohesion. Maintaining that cohesion is critical to sustaining support for Ukraine and deterring Russian escalation. Now, my comment. In 2023, there is already negative movement in Hungary, Poland, and following the recent parliamentary elections, probably in Slovakia. Germany has long been seen as less enthusiastic than the US in its support of NATO's role in the war. Germany wants to get back to trade with Russia rather than have this. And this is also putting enormous pressure on the military logistics and the equipment that these NATO members are providing to Ukraine. In the beginning, there was a lot of obsolete equipment that was being sent, and that's run out. And they're now pressing for state-of-the-art equipment, which we as well as many others are going to be reluctant to give. There is also our own congressional division on support for the Ukrainian cause. Funding for the war effort was excised from the bill to keep the US government funded. Some congressional critics, mostly on the right, are saying that the money could be better used to deal with the migrant issue in the Caribbean and Latin America. The second assessment, a continued incremental approach to providing greater support to Ukraine could limit escalation risk, but it would work against Ukraine if Russia fields new forces quickly and Ukrainian losses increase. And my comment is, I would say geography, population work in Russia's favor, especially in the long term. It just outnumbers it all and surrounds Ukraine. And with Belarus now becoming a largely dependable vassal to Moscow, that's also something Kiev has to worry about. Next, Putin may be politically unable to reduce his war aims, giving him less room to maneuver. Well, Putin faces opposition from the right and the left, and the right is better organized. I listened to a Zoom call this morning of Russian emigres, recent emigres that are politicking through Europe and the United States, trying to come up with ways in which to remove Putin, and they can't agree with each other. It was like herding cats. The moderator trying to keep them on focus. More destructive attacks against Ukraine's civilian population could initiate an escalatory spiral if Ukraine retaliates with intensified attacks inside Russia. Well, it's not yet on the table, although it's been discussed. Should Putin be pushed against the wall, he has the ability to use tactical nuclear weapons. I'm not saying that he will, but those are available to take this to another level. Internal instability in Russia is likely to influence Putin's calculations, but the direction of its effects is not yet clear. Well, Russian culture allows a great deal of muddling through life, history, conflict until it erupts. Those were those wonderful peasant revolts that would occur during the Tsarist times. And a few nobles would have been killed in the process, and an awful lot of peasants would have been killed as well. There is no credible replacement visible for Putin at this point in time, and I see more muddling. The U.S. ability to control future escalation may diminish. U.S. and allied policymakers should plan to respond to Russian escalation while striving to maintain diplomatic and military communication channels with Russia that could arrest an escalatory spiral. That's a nice term, escalatory spiral. Okay, having been part of diplomatic confidential communication with groups in Southern Africa during my tour there in Lusaka, Zambia, which these groups we identified as terrorists, and which we would not have any public connections to. I assume we are, and I was part of a process of communicating with these groups. I assume we are still talking to the Russians, though the quality of the public remarks, especially from the president, reminds me of George Kennan's comments on our relations with Russia that he said many years ago. And I quote, we will get nowhere with an attitude of emotional indignation directed toward an entire people. Additionally, because of the rules of NATO decision making, which means everyone has to agree before a policy can be pursued. There are changes developing that I mentioned earlier, where Hungary, certainly, Turkey occasionally, and Poland and maybe Slovakia have different ideas about supporting Ukraine than the US. And adding to this assessment from Rand, I'll bring up something on technology. The tech world is critical to military strategy. The country that develops a new technology and factors it into its military or national security strategy has important advantages. Look at World War II and the debate we had over battleships, which were where the admirals wanted to live, and the development of carriers. It took us a long time, either probably through retirements or just being told that they were going to be moving to carriers before the Navy Department moved in that direction. That brings us to the technological advances affecting the war in Ukraine. Ships, tanks, planes are all vulnerable to drones and the new hypersonic weapons. While drones have played an outsized role in Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 22, both the sheer number of unmanned aircraft and their effectiveness have increased significantly, with Moscow quickly catching up and sometimes surpassing Ukraine's capabilities. New types of drones developed domestically and imported are reaching the battlefield all the time, including naval drones that Ukraine has successfully used to damage Russia's Black Sea fleet. Many drones that were effective just months ago have become outdated, need to be re-engineered because they could be jammed. Giving you another perspective on what's going on, George Friedman, who was the chairman of Geopolitical Futures, a commercial intelligence operation that I have subscribed to for many years, opined on Tuesday of this week on the state of the war. And I'll quote, The American-Russian War was in certain ways distinct from the Russian-Ukrainian War. Think about that for a second. Russia's fears was that an American force on the Ukrainian border could attack Moscow, some 300 miles away. The Americans feared that the fall of Ukraine would bring Russian forces to the eastern line of NATO nations, restarting the Cold War. In this sense, according to Friedman, the war has little to do with Ukraine, save that it has savaged the country, and the war is sliding towards a painful and dangerous Cold War. Zelensky believed that if American intervention did not cause the Russians to abort, then it would at least, if American intervention did not cause the Russians to abort, then it would at least allow Ukraine to counterattack at a vast scale. But the United States is engaged in a different conflict, keeping Russia away from NATO. It would provide sufficient force to keep the Russians at a distance, but not enough to crush them. Russia has kept the US away from its border, but little else. Ukraine has retained sovereignty over a good deal of the country, about 80%. And the US has made a Russian penetration beyond Ukraine highly unlikely. The US reached its goal, while Russia and Ukraine have not, and according to Friedman, will not. However, neither have been crushed. Ukraine is now a divided country, but enough of it is intact to claim victory. And Russia has pushed past its old border enough to claim a small victory. Both could claim humanitarian reasons for ending the war. So, he concludes, having fought and defended for coming on 2 years, how the war ends is reasonably clear. How long it will take for the leaders to admit what is obvious is the question. Everyone lost this war, and in due course, so will the leaders. And that is what will delay the inevitable peace. End of quote. But there are other things going on as well. Well, Moscow was pretty much focused on Ukraine. There are things going on in other parts of the former Soviet Union, but the focus in recent days is on the Caucasus. Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan make up the region. I had the pleasure of traveling through all of them several times. Georgia has elections coming up in 2024 that could affect its position on relations with Russia. Although Abkhazia and South Ossetia, those two little sort of puce-colored countries in Georgia, are a problem. And Russia just announced that it's going to build in Abkhazia, they're going to build a naval station. This is probably because the Black Sea, the Crimean Peninsula, Sevastopol, has been bombed so much. So they're going to create a naval site in Abkhazia. The Georgians will not like that. The main hotspot in the region is Nagorno-Karabakh, that little green slice there, right in the middle of Azerbaijan. It is a principally Armenian enclave, and it is the product of a 1992 breakup of the Soviet Union. Well, that's when all of these republics became states. At the same time, there was this little enclave decided it was going to make itself, and they had worked out some way in which to communicate with Armenia proper. The Ukrainian war appears to have forced Moscow to allow the Azeris, and that's what the Azerbaijanis are called, Azeris, basically to end the autonomy of about 200,000 Armenians who lived in the Green area in Azerbaijan. Considering the cultural differences between the Armenians and the Azeris, this was an issue that was not going away. The leader of the self-proclaimed Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh announced on September 28 that he had signed an order dissolving all state institutions from January 1, 2024. More than half of its majority ethnic Armenian population, and I believe that's 2024, it didn't say, that could go back, that could be retroactive to January 1st of 2023. So there's a little ambiguity on that. So don't hold me to that. The region is recognized internationally as part of Azerbaijan, but Armenia took control in the 1990s following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The president of the Armenian enclave said the decision to dissolve the state was, and I quote him, based on the priority of ensuring the physical security and vital interests of the people, and referencing Azerbaijan's agreements that there would be free, voluntary, and unhindered travel is ensured to residents. The Caucasus are an important strategic zone for Russia, and owning it or controlling it, or at least having it as a neutral, is vital to Russian rulers, though I would suggest not as important as the role of Ukraine and Belarus in the West. Well, let's take a look at this man. According to Thomas Graham, someone I knew back in Soviet days, now an expert on Russia at the Council on Foreign Relations, Putin remains firmly in control of Russia today, but he has three challenges to think about going forward. First, regarding the war in Ukraine, while there were serious setbacks in 22, in 23, Russia was able to hold its own militarily and economically. They have worked ways with a number of countries in the world. We'll get into that in the last slide, to make sure that they were getting enough revenue in from the sale of oil and natural gas. What happens in 2024 is up in the air. Second point he makes, regarding the Russian people, if you can believe Russian polling, and that's my comment, because I'm highly suspicious. I'm highly suspicious of polling in general. We find that pollers generally have intended outcomes, and also they have so much resistance to their attempts to try to reach us, and so many of us refuse to talk to them, that they're making judgments on, I would say, incomplete information. The next big test, according to the Graham, his approval rating is 80%. That probably is, I don't know. It's probably, it's where he has been for a long time. The next big test are the March 2024 elections, the presidential elections. While some countries wait for the votes to be counted, Russia often, and in the Soviet Union as well, defines in advance what they expect in terms of totals. And Graham suggests about a 70% for both turnout and endorsement is what Putin's government would seek in the March 24 elections. Graham points out that Russian elites will watch to see if Putin is able to meet those numbers. So there is a barometer here. It's just not the one that we would recognize. 3, regarding managing elites, Graham sees this as Putin's most formidable challenge, as Western sanctions continue to harass many of them. As oligarchs and sub-oligarchs and their companies are affected by sanctions and economic changes that come out of being at war, competition within these elites will require more of Putin's attention. So let's go to our conclusion. And what does this all lead to? Well, according to The Economist magazine, by invading Ukraine, Putin has sped up the process of dividing up the world. I've been talking about this for about back when I still had the television program before the pandemic, a couple of years before that. So I was saying, watch the way in which the world is going to divide itself in this post-Cold War era. We went through about 30 years of from 92 to 2023. That's 30 years. We provided the model for international economics, political interaction, as well as the legal framework. China had been earlier pushing up against this. So are other countries. By invading Ukraine, Putin has sped up the process of dividing up the world. The West and its allies have presented a rare, unified front against the Russian president's attack. NATO is enjoying a surge of support within its member countries. The Economist has looked at government actions globally since the war broke out and countries' historical ties to Russia, and divides the world into three broad categories: West-leaning, Russia-leaning, and neutral. A total of 131 countries are against Russia. Most rich ones in North America and Europe fall into this club. Even historically neutral governments, such as Finland, Sweden, and Switzerland, have taken a stance against the invasion. And Turkey has finally allowed Sweden to become part of NATO. The West-leaning camp it makes up more than 70% of the world's GDP, gross domestic product. But although the countries opposing Russia account for only 36% of the world's population, about 2/3 of people live in countries whose governments are either neutral, put India onto that camp, or Russia-leaning. China and India, which together account for about 1/3 of the global population, skew the results, obviously. The Chinese government, classified as Russia-leaning by The Economist, has avoided direct condemnation of Putin's actions and is unlikely to stand with the West. India's government, classed as neutral, has increased its engagement with the Russian government, especially with discounted oil prices. It is not just the governments of these hugely populous countries that are neutral or Russia-leaning. According to a survey in India conducted by YouGov, a pollster, in March of this year, 40% of respondents approved of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. 54% of those polled approved of Putin's leadership. No such data has been collected in China, but online polls indicate greater support for Russia. About 30% of the global population live in 28 countries whose government are classed as leaning towards Russia, as well as China. No, leaning towards Russia. As well as China, these include such populous places as Pakistan and Ethiopia. I think Iran should be put into this category. For some, such as Eritrea and Syria, Russia is a key ally. 32 governments have remained neutral, including Bangladesh, Brazil, and India. Several developing countries see neutrality as the default foreign policy choice. which is a legacy of the Cold War, when the non-aligned movement had Sukarno and Nehru and Tito, and who's the fourth? I don't have it. They formed the non-aligned movement so that they weren't going to be caught up in either the West or the Soviet camps. Mr. Putin's campaign in Ukraine, according to the Economist, has met widespread condemnation in the West. But for now, by no means does everyone regard him and his country as pariahs. Thank you. Questions? I'm gonna sit down. No. We have yes, the United States has in the CIA an office that studies the psychological profile of world leaders, especially ones we don't particularly get along with. That would have been just too easy a story to come out. I don't see any validity to that story. Yes.
What role is China and Korea playing now, and what do you think they're going to be doing in a year from now?
In terms of Ukraine or in terms of
Russia?
Okay, the question is, what is China and North Korea doing in terms of Russia's actions? Probably, and this really does work around the Ukrainian question of the war. China has been very careful, especially since they've been having economic problems, not to come out directly in support of the invasion of Ukraine. On the other hand, I can't imagine that they're not supplying them with things that they need. I just can't imagine it. North Korea is using Russia as another way in which to open up its access to this group of autocracies, as I call them, and is supplying drones and ammunition to Russia. Now, how China feels about that is interesting because, basically, even though North Korea is not that far removed from Russia's border, it's the outback of Russia, and Russia isn't as intensely involved in the struggle between Japan, China, the United States, and the countries of Southeast Asia, and what's happening with China expanding its military presence in the region. So I would say that in Russia, economics is subservient to national security political goals. I think under Xi Jinping, that is true too. It wasn't true under Deng Xiaoping, who was the one who built the economic machine. But I think it is true, that is true to a degree, and it's not the same. That Chinese culture is different from Russian culture. So I think China will continue to be careful in terms of how it moves. North Korea will not necessarily be. They haven't been careful in almost any of the things that they're doing, including their missile tests.
Are they going to actively help the Russians?
I think they already have. The North Koreans have, with drones and with ammunition. And I suspect that China has helped as well. Apparently not, because if so, I mean, right now, Ukraine's, I would say, Ukraine's counteroffensive has failed. In October, those roads are mud where there are roads. Tanks are not moving. All those Leopolds that they were bringing in and other tanks, uh, tanks again are highly vulnerable to drones, and Russia is moving quickly on the drone front as well. Russia is not a backward country scientifically. I mean, I went out to Akadem Garadok in Novosibirsk when my first tour there in the late 70s. And I was stunned by the kind of research they were doing there. It was on top of what was happening in the world.
Do they collaborate with the Chinese?
There's an old adage in Russia that respect flows west and contempt flows east. Actually, that applies to Eastern Europe too. So as the closer you get to China, the more xenophobic the Russians become. They've had dust ups in the 50s, and then it was in the 90s, the early 90s they did have a dust up. Yeah, on the border. China has always resented Russia, the Soviet Union, trying to be the top dog. China culturally doesn't want to be a second dog to anyone, it appears. More questions?
That, that was a great presentation, John. Thank you. And that is an extremely interesting map, particularly from the subject of demographics. And that, in about another 10 years, where the populations are going to be expanding and where they're contracting, I think is going to have a lot to do with what color some of those countries represent, particularly in Africa. We tend to think of Africa as it's a real population bomb. And the French are being run out of there on a rail right now. They don't have any Africa connection anymore. And I think that's true with a lot of our NATO allies that they don't really have anything to play in Africa anymore. And with a lot of the other tangential aspects of how these controls and autocracies develop, I think if we're attempting a long game with Ukraine, that might be a little bit difficult to maintain.
The Economist has a cover of its. Generally have two covers, one for the United States, one for the rest of the world. And one of the covers is Africa Lost. There have been so many coups that are occurring in Africa. And if you think about it, okay, you're an African leader and things are getting really tough. And you're being pushed by both sides to ally. Well, the way in which you deal with that kind of situation is not turning to the people and asking them for permission to do one thing or another, as we do in a democracy. You jump, you leap, you take charge, and you make decisions. And often it's based on which tribe you're in, if it's in Africa. Zambia has 5 major tribes, and there's a constant battle as to which tribe is going to take state house. And when one tribe takes the presidency, that means that they fill it. And if you thought that the kinds of things that our political parties do after an election in terms of changing, you haven't seen what will happen. Basically, everyone goes, and you put in your own people. So Africa and China has been very active in Africa, But China is sometimes like we are, our own worst enemy. Um, we come in and we say we want to help, but then we have all these conditions. Well, China has conditions too when they come in. And sometimes I know in Zambia, I spent 3 years in Zambia in Central Africa while Southern Africa was going through, Zimbabwe just came into existence and South Africa was moving in the direction of, and I had actually, when I referred to these close conversations, I had Thabo Mbeki, who was a president of South Africa at one time, who was the political head of the ANC, the African National Congress, in my office on a regular basis, and I was having him talk with visitors coming in from Washington to try and get a sense of where they were going, while at the same time we're condemning them. Other questions? Go ahead.
It seems like what the United States and maybe NATO is doing is trying to create a NATO East to contain China. Is that driving China closer to Russia?
No, I don't think NATO, I don't think most of the European countries in NATO have any interest in getting into a spitting contest with China. In fact, I think I just read in the last couple of days, Germany has just had economic talks with China.
But I think you're referring to Asia and the alliances amongst with the
The Quad, like the Quad.
and the Australians and the New Zealanders.
Okay.
And the Philippines, right?
NATO hasn't
That was
any,
the-
yeah, NATO has no,
Counter China. Is that
that isn't a NATO priority right now.
okay? So there's no link between those.
I don't see that yet.
But does China feel threatened by this group of
The Quad.
I imagine so.
Yes,
I imagine so.
yes, yes. And in fact, they've almost changed their policy towards Australia, and have been, after really going negative on them, they're being much more accommodating and opening themselves to talks with the Aussies. They must like their beer.
But that's not making China a little bit more pro-Russian because they see their
Sure. Yes. Well, and look at India in this case. India is a member of the Quad. The Quad meaning India, United States, Australia, and Japan. And these four countries are loosely connected in terms of offsetting China's aggression, especially in Southeast Asia. And but India is having much more not cordial, but more professional relations with Russia. So there is a split in terms of where you are, what are your issues, and who at this point in time are you prepared to work with, and who are you not?
China, or I mean with India or with all of them.
I think India as a neutral goes in this way. Turkey is another interesting place. Turkey's a member of NATO. But it really fits more into the neutral category because it's trying to develop itself as a hub, and it would welcome Russian oil coming down to go into its hub to be dispersed in lots of different directions. So we're in a changing environment where the world is beginning to reorganize itself. And when you have some previous models, like we talked about the non-alignment movement from the Cold War with the Soviets, but it won't necessarily be the same. It is unlikely to be the same. And the fact that China is an important economy in the world changes this significantly, where the Soviet Union was not. It was an important military and political factor, the Soviet Union, but not an important economic factor.
I guess one last question. Who's losing the war in Ukraine?
Everybody.
John, we can't hear you.
Who is losing the war in Ukraine? And my answer is everybody. I think George Friedman hit it right on the head.
Everybody, Russia, Ukraine, NATO.
NATO, everybody.
So what are they gonna do about it?
Well, that's well, when well, or if there's a change. I mean, Russia. I said geography and population is a big factor in this. Russia is got more industrial, more uh, military capabilities than Ukraine has, even with Western support. Ukraine has a limited population, and it lost a lot of people, and a lot of those were young people who fled elsewhere. Yeah. Well, it and are now no one, yeah, as I said, Churchill covered it very nicely at the beginning of World War II. The first casualty in a war is the truth. Every country, you have to look askance or with skepticism or with a grain of salt at what anyone's saying about what's been happening.
Where are we getting the Ukrainian propaganda? It sounds,
Well, because and to a degree, it's our propaganda because we have we have we. I was in Yugoslavia as it came apart, and I watched the way we prosecuted that war. Milosevic was a bad guy. There was no question about it from our point of view. He was a strong man within Yugoslavia, but we simplify things, and it's even easier for our governments now because they really aren't using the input necessarily from the field. They've got so many assistants and experts and so much information flowing in that they're making these decisions within the National Security Council and within the Washington area. Well, anyone who's spent any time in Washington knows it's kind of like Madison. It's a little place surrounded by reality. Well, that's the same thing about Washington. It's a big place surrounded by reality.
I was gonna ask, from your perspective, the role of diplomacy, and who is gonna be that honest broker that admittedly Russia and Ukraine probably aren't gonna achieve their goals from this conflict that, as you pointed out, that they're pretty clear. But who is gonna breach that gap and get to the point where they can both declare peace with honor and everybody goes home? Do you
Yeah.
see it in a country or a leader somewhere that could do that?
Well, the one that jumps to mind is Turkey. Turkey orchestrated the grain shipments in 2022. Turkey has a foot in both camps. Now, Turkey would not, I don't think, would be not seen as an unacceptable interlocutor from Russia. Turkey is a member of NATO, so from our point of view, that would be the issue. And I think Friedman played around with this. The way this is going to probably be decided is we and the Russians decide to stop this. The problem is, where are the Ukrainians in this decision-making process? And you have to say, as he pointed out, neither of them have been crushed. No, neither of them have lost. And when a country, an army surrenders, but has no, not surrendering is one thing. When they have a settlement and you haven't lost, really lost, it's not over. I mean, we're seeing right now in Yugoslavia, Serbia and Kosovo, right at the edge of it. And I've said this for years. This is not over. Kosovo is the birthplace of the Serb people. They- They're not going to let that slide easily into the past. There are things like NATO membership or EU membership that might, not NATO membership, but EU membership that might look enticing. But economics is not like it is in this country, the dominant driver. Lots of places in the world have historical. I mean, someone described the Balkans as too many peoples went in too small a space, too many religions, and too much history.
Did Zelensky paint himself into a corner by saying he's going to liberate every inch, including the Crimea of the Ukraine? So he can,
No, I don't. I think that's kind of a campaign stump speech. When it comes down, that's going to be that's the hard thing. I don't know that the Ukrainian people wouldn't be relieved to end the war. Leaderships are another matter. I mean, leaderships are egos. Leaderships are commitments. It's hard to move past that. I mean, that you have to live with that for the rest of your life. Now we're into territory way beyond anything I can comment on.
That'd be the last question.
Well, we talked a lot about this. American leaders.
Last question. Are you all okay?
When the war ends, well, all wars end. And Russia, even if Russia wins, who's going to rebuild Ukraine?
Well,
Pay for it besides you and me?
uh, that is one option. They have floated the idea of taking Russia's impounded resources, which would be breaking all international law. But who knows? We're breaking all kinds of laws and rules and things. So who knows where this is going? Uh, yeah, Ukraine is really, this is almost a proxy war. This is almost a proxy war. So that makes it very difficult.
With the historical perspective of, say, about the last 50 years, these proxy wars don't really end well for the host country. They will be several generations before they ever see light at the end of the tunnel as far as what is it going to look like
Sure.
as a future Ukraine that is remotely viable or has any potential for being a member of international organizations.
Sure. Look at the way we have two major funding bills that were approved by the Congress in 21 and 22, infrastructure, and I forget what the second one is called, that have trillions of dollars involved. And how much of that has actually been spent? Probably very little, very little. Uh, and we have an infrastructure for dealing with this. It would, if the war were to end right now, and they would be able to, within a reasonable period of time, like 6 months to a year, decide what would be the vehicle for trying to reconstruct it. That's going to take a long time. It's not going to be a snap decision. It's going to be in lots of negotiations. Uh, it will take, after that is decided on, who's going to do it, because there's a lot of companies that would be very anxious to go in there and do the reconstruction. You count on that. Well, of course they do. That's why they're only going to go if there's someone paying for it. So think about how long that process has to go on. We're talking decades. So on that happy note, this war, you said wars always end. They don't. Some come. The war in Yugoslavia is not over. It may. Yeah, Vietnam. Well, we didn't call that a war, did we? No, that was Korea. All right. Thank you all very much. Oh, Peter,